The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people settled into their seats, some shifting uncomfortably in the wooden benches. The air was thick with anticipation. Every case that came through this courtroom had weight, but today, there was an unspoken curiosity rippling through the spectators. Everyone wanted to see how this one would unfold. At the center of it all sat a young woman, barely in her mid-20s, with an aura that suggested she had never known struggle a single day in her life. Her designer outfit, crisp and spotless, fit her like it had been tailored just for this moment. Every strand of her golden blonde hair was in place, cascading down her back like she had just stepped out of a salon. Even the way she sat, legs crossed, back straight, exuded confidence or rather entitlement. She wasn't like the others in the room. She knew it and so did everyone else. While the atmosphere in the courtroom carried the usual seriousness, she seemed untouched by it. Her manicured fingers reached into her luxury handbag, pulling out a small, sleek nail file. Without hesitation, she lifted her hand and began gliding the file over the tip of her nails, her expression one of utter boredom. It was as if the proceedings around her were nothing more than background noise, an inconvenience she had to sit through before getting back to her real life, the lavish parties, the shopping sprees, the expensive vacations. A few people exchanged glances, some raising their brows in disbelief. Who did this girl think she was? Did she not understand where she was? Or worse, did she simply not care? The soft scraping sound of the nail file against her perfectly polished nails was barely audible, but in the heavy silence of the courtroom, it might as well have been a scream. Across the room, the judge sat behind his towering bench, his presence commanding without him needing to say a word. His dark brown eyes, sharp and observant, took in every detail. He had seen many types of people in his courtroom, liars, manipulators, the desperate, the regretful. But this was something else entirely. A blatant, almost arrogant disregard for the place she was in. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor, a woman who had worked her way up from nothing, cleared her throat, attempting to regain the court's focus. But even she struggled to ignore the display happening just feet away. The defense attorney cast a sideways glance at his client, shifting slightly in his seat, knowing this wasn't going to help their case. Still, the young woman remained unfazed, blowing lightly on her nails as if she were at a spa instead of sitting in front of a judge who held her fate in his hands. If she noticed the growing tension in the room, she gave no sign. If she cared about the weight of what was happening, she certainly didn't show it. A man sitting in the back, someone who had spent more nights in jail than he could count, leaned forward slightly, his mouth curling into an amused smirk. He had seen arrogance before, but this was a whole new level. Even he knew better than to disrespect a judge like that. The judge's grip tightened on his gavel for a brief moment before he released it, resting his hands calmly in front of him. He wasn't an impulsive man. He didn't let emotions dictate his decisions. He had worked too hard for that. But disrespect, outright, shameless disrespect, was something he never tolerated in his courtroom. Not from criminals, not from attorneys, and certainly not from someone who thought her wealth could shield her from consequences. The tension in the room thickened, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on everyone. People held their breath, waiting, wondering. How long would she keep this up? And more importantly, how long before the judge decided he had seen enough? The judge's gaze lingered on the young woman, his expression unreadable, but there was a stillness in his posture that sent an unspoken message. He had noticed. Everyone had. Yet she remained oblivious or, worse, completely indifferent to the weight of the moment. The soft, rhythmic scrape of the nail file continued, the only sound cutting through the heavy silence of the courtroom. People shifted in their seats, their discomfort growing. Some looked at each other with disbelief, while others stole quick glances at the judge, trying to read his reaction. The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line as she shot a quick glance at the defense attorney, who looked equally uneasy. He hesitated, then leaned in slightly toward his client, whispering, "Put that away." The young woman barely turned her head. She let out a soft, exasperated sigh, as if she had just been asked to do something beneath her. Her fingers stilled for a moment before she shrugged, not even sparing him a proper look. "Relax," she muttered under her breath. "It's just a stupid trial." The whisper wasn't loud, but in the charged silence of the courtroom, it was heard. A murmur rippled through the audience, a mixture of disbelief and suppressed amusement. The woman sitting in the front row, a mother whose son had once stood trial in this very courtroom, shook her head, her jaw tightening. An older man a few rows back, who had seen his fair share of trials, exhaled sharply, the disbelief clear on his face. The judge remained motionless, his expression carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes, something cold and unyielding. His fingers lightly tapped against the wood of his bench. What? Twice. Then silence. The type of silence that made people's stomachs tighten. The prosecutor cleared her throat, forcing herself to focus on the case at hand, though the tension in the air made it nearly impossible to ignore what had just happened. She turned her attention to her notes, trying to regain control of the moment. Your Honor, as I was saying, she began, her voice level but firm, the evidence clearly establishes. Another scrape. The courtroom, which had just started to regain its rhythm, fell apart once more as the sound of the nail file disrupted everything. The prosecutor hesitated mid-sentence. Her eyes flickered toward the defendant, the disbelief now replaced with something closer to controlled fury. This time even the judge's posture changed. It was subtle, just a slight shift of his shoulders, the smallest narrowing of his eyes, but it was enough. The defense attorney pinched the bridge of his nose, inhaling sharply. For God's sake, he whispered under his breath, but it was no use. The rich girl, still completely unfazed, casually blew on her nails, inspecting them like she was sitting in a high-end salon rather than a courtroom where her future was being decided. The judge finally moved. His voice when he spoke was calm. Too calm. Miss Carter. The room froze. The young woman finally lifted her head, her blue eyes flickering up lazily, as if being addressed was some kind of inconvenience. She blinked, seemingly surprised that she had even been noticed. She hummed, her tone laced with boredom. A low murmur spread through the courtroom again. The audacity. The sheer arrogance in that single sound sent a chill down the spines of those who understood exactly what kind of moment this was. The judge stared at her for a long moment, his expression betraying nothing. Then he leaned forward just slightly, his fingers interlacing as he rested his elbows on the bench. You are in my courtroom, he said, his voice steady, slow, and deliberate. And yet, you seem to believe you are elsewhere. So let me remind you. The young woman raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing together in a way that suggested she wasn't used to being spoken to like this. This is not a social gathering, the judge continued. This is not your private lounge, and I am not someone you dismiss with a flick of your hand. The words cut through the air like a blade. The people in the room, who had been trying to suppress their reactions, no longer even pretended to look away. They were locked in, watching, waiting. For the first time, the rich girl's expression faltered, just slightly. A tiny crease formed between her brows, but it disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared. She straightened her posture, shifting in her seat, but her fingers still held the nail file. The judge's eyes flickered down to it, and for a moment, it felt like the temperature in the room dropped. Put it away, he said. It was not a request. A beat of silence. A slow, heavy pause that carried the weight of something inevitable. The young woman hesitated, then rolled her eyes, before tossing the nail file back into her bag with an audible sigh. It was a move so dismissive, so full of mockery, that even the bailiff tightened his jaw. The judge exhaled slowly, and in that moment, something shifted in the air. The kind of shift that precedes a storm. The courtroom was no longer just a place of justice. It was a place where lessons were about to be learned. The silence that followed was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced before. It wasn't just quiet, it was thick, heavy, pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The air itself seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, as if the very walls of the room understood the magnitude of what had just happened. The judge remained still, his gaze locked onto the young woman before him. His fingers, once interlaced, now rested firmly on the bench. There was no anger in his expression, no outburst of frustration. If anything, the calmness in his eyes was far more unsettling. The prosecutor held her breath. The defense attorney wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, stealing a glance at his client, who had just committed what could only be described as social suicide in a court of law. The rich girl, however, still didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the moment. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between boredom and mild annoyance. So, the judge finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with something colder this time. You think this is funny? The girl blinked. Excuse me? You believe the courtroom is beneath you, the judge continued, his tone unwavering. That the laws we uphold, the justice we serve, is nothing more than an inconvenience to your day. The young woman scoffed lightly, shifting in her seat. I never said that. You didn't have to, the judge replied, tilting his head slightly. Your action said everything for you. A hush spread through the room. Every person from the clerks to the spectators felt it. There was no escaping it now. The judge was making this moment matter. The rich girl exhaled, tapping her manicured fingers against the desk in front of her. "Look, Your Honor," she said, forcing a small laugh as if trying to downplay the situation. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I was just, I don't know, distracted." "Distracted?" the judge repeated, his voice dangerously even. She nodded, waving a hand dismissively. "Yeah, it's just like, this whole thing feels kind of ridiculous, you know? I mean, I've seen courtroom dramas before and they always make it seem so intense, but this," she shrugged, "it's kind of dragging." A few gasps echoed through the room. One man in the back actually let out a low whistle under his breath. The defense attorney visibly winced. The judge leaned forward slightly, his presence alone filling the space. "Dragging?" he repeated, the weight of the word sitting between them like a warning. The young woman nodded again, seemingly unaware, or uncaring, of the storm brewing in front of her. "I mean, yeah. No offense, but this is all a bit much." For a long moment the judge just stared at her. Then, slowly he removed his reading glasses, setting them down carefully on the bench. "You've never had to fight for anything in your life, have you?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet power that sent chills through the room. The rich girl frowned, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. "Excuse me?" "You've never had to wake up wondering if you'd be able to afford your next meal," the judge continued, his voice growing colder. "Never had to sit in a waiting room, praying for a job that could barely cover the bills. Never had to watch your parents break themselves just to keep a roof over your head." The room was utterly still. "You've walked through life believing that the rules don't apply to you," the judge said, his words slow and deliberate. "That money, status, and a last name can bend the world to your will." The girl's face twitched slightly, her confidence faltering just for a second. "But in this room," the judge continued, "in my courtroom, none of that matters. Here the law is blind to your privilege. Here respect is not a suggestion, it's a requirement." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. For the first time the rich girl didn't have a quick comeback. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The judge let the silence stretch, letting the lesson sink in. Then he spoke again, his voice even more measured than before. "And since you seem to struggle with understanding that, allow me to clarify it for you in a way that even you won't forget." The judge's voice carried through the courtroom with a weight that made every single person sit up a little straighter. His words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They sliced through the air like a blade, sharp and deliberate. The rich girl swallowed, shifting slightly in her seat. For the first time since the proceedings began, a flicker of something different crossed her face. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't boredom. It was something closer to uncertainty. Maybe even fear. The judge tapped his fingers against the desk, his expression unchanging. "Miss Carter, stand up." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the audience. The girl hesitated, then slowly pushed herself up, smoothing out her designer dress as if that would somehow restore the control she had just lost. Her jaw was tight, but she obeyed. The judge leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I've seen many people stand before me, but few as blatantly disrespectful as you. And that is saying something." She sucked in a breath as if preparing to argue, but for once she said nothing. "You don't think this matters?" the judge continued. "You don't think this court, this process, deserves your attention? You came in here treating it like an inconvenience. A joke. And for that, I'm going to make sure you never forget what real consequences feel like." Her fingers twitched slightly, but she stayed still, her lips pressing into a thin line. The judge reached for a document in front of him, flipping through the pages carefully. The room was so quiet that the sound of the paper shifting was almost deafening. He finally set it down and looked up. "Miss Carter, your actions today have not only been an insult to this court, but they have also shown a level of disregard that cannot go unanswered. Since you seem to think that time in a courtroom is beneath you, I will grant you the opportunity to spend your time elsewhere. Behind bars." A gasp broke through the courtroom. Even the defense attorney jolted upright, his mouth parting in shock. The rich girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Wait, what?" The judge didn't flinch. 30 days in county jail for contempt of court. The air shifted. People exchanged glances, some struggling to hide their satisfaction. The young woman let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking." The judge remained still. "Does it look like I'm joking?" Her face paled. She turned to her attorney, her voice dropping into a frantic whisper. "Do something." The defense attorney, still recovering from the bombshell, hesitated. "Your Honor, surely we can discuss." "The discussion is over," the judge interrupted, his voice firm. Miss Carter had every opportunity to show respect to this courtroom. She chose not to. And now she will face the consequences of that choice. The young woman's breathing picked up. Her confidence, her smugness, it was all gone now. She turned back to the judge, her voice no longer dripping with entitlement. "Please, Your Honor," she said, her tone softer, almost pleading. "I didn't mean." "It doesn't matter what you meant," the judge cut her off. "It matters what you did." The bailiff stepped forward. The girl took a step back instinctively, her breath hitching. Panic flashed across her face. Wait, please. I'm sorry. I swear I didn't mean any harm. I was just." The judge's gaze didn't waver. Too late. Her hands trembled as the bailiff took hold of her wrist. She jerked slightly, her mind racing, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to be in real trouble. But now reality crashed down on her all at once. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, the weight of her actions settled onto her shoulders like a crushing force. The world she thought she controlled had just turned its back on her, and for the first time in her life, there was nothing she could do about it.